Now, there's many ways to destroy a country, by the way. And if you look at genocide and ethnic cleansing, there's different definitions basically for them. But what comes under the Geneva Convention for it is to destroy a people using various techniques. You can either do it economically. One, it's a big one, is destroy people economically. You could starve them to death. You can create depression, because people have no future, get awfully depressed. And then you introduce drugs into the country big time. And those who are depressed will take the drugs to escape the misery of living. They've found this works awfully well with American Indians in Canada, for instance. And there's no shortage of supply to drugs and even glue for sniffing for the children. And it's been going on for years as they die off. But also using it in places like Scotland too. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix, talking about techniques of destroying whole peoples. And one way, of course, is eliminate the language they use by forcing another language on them. That was done to Scotland back in the 1700s and the 1800s under the Highland clearances, where they were deporting many of the Highlander people who spoke Gaelic, of course, and who were found speaking it in the tongue for quite a few years, or even wearing tartan for that matter, for the clan that you belonged to. You were hung on the spot by the troops. So there's one way of doing it, and eventually they relented on that once they'd cleared enough out the country, or killed them off. And they've done it in other countries too. But in America too, as I say, in Canada especially, you can go into any of these reservations and they've got terrible drug problems. So it's to make sure drugs flow in. Because the people you see, and Darwin mentions this too, who are having their cultures destroyed by what they claim as a superior culture is in charge, then they go into utter self-destruction. It's well understood. And with Scotland, for instance, with the massive propaganda, multiculturalism, massive immigration and so on, and we're all the same and everybody's the same, you lose your culture altogether if you are the dominant culture that's been there for a long, long time, and you feel you belong to nothing. And I've had Scots people say that, and English folk too. I don't know what it is to me to be British anymore, or English or Scottish. They don't know. They feel they're just lost. They're ignored. And that was one of the reasons they were ignored, because the Labour Party for years imported people basically from outside countries, from diverse countries, and then helped start them up even in businesses across the country where they'd have to pay tax for about 15 years, and gave them business to start with, and funding. And the people that should have been supporting Labour were totally ignored, and because they would not have revolutions, and Labour wanted to bring in folk who might have revolutions. Anyway, there's always these wars going on, and the public are completely oblivious to the real reasons that are going on. Anyway, as I say, GIRFEC is a program in Scotland where, as I say, you get a guardian appointed to you at birth, basically, by the state, and then you have checkups all the time to see your emotional health, your well-being, and of course, it's graduated too to see if you're politically correct with all your ideas. If not, you'd be rectified rather quickly, and much like Clockwork Orange, I'm sure, before you're even 10 years old. And then they'll have their ideal citizens. So that's a test bed for the world. And GIRFEC has associations from the United Nations working with them. Even Sarkozy, the ex-president of France, he was also helping set it up too. And it's going on and on. So that's part of eradicating a people and a culture. Anyway, it says here the Scottish Government claims to have an approach over the past few years based on recovery for drugs and so on. However, these figures are another suggested approach is not being effectively implemented on the ground. It says this shouldn't be investigated as a matter of urgency, or it should be, and we need to spell out clearly how we intend to tackle the problem, because what they're claiming is sick hospital patients are squeezed out by the drug users. You can actually go into some really depressed areas now in the country, and you'll see the needles and syringes hanging out the arms. Children on doorsteps now. Now, when I was growing up, there was none of that at all. Everybody knew who they were. Everybody knew what we were, what our neighbours were. You're all Scots. Although that was getting hammered after you at school as well. And by design. And but once it goes, as I say, Darwin said it, you eventually self-destruct. If you don't know what you are anymore, and you're being ignored by the people who are supposed to be in charge of you. The Scottish National Party is not, as far as I'm concerned, Scottish at all. And it's completely globalist, and it's pretty well communist in many ways too. And it says that a rising number of drug users are clogging up Lothian hospitals as a result of substance abuse, figures reveal. And then they go into the different drugs that are out there in the streets big time. Opioids, including heroin and methadone, were by far the most common cause of acute hospital visits, accounting for 730 discharges in the region over the year-long period. Cannabinoids, which are from cannabis, sedatives and cocaine also led to stints in hospital. The figures don't include alcohol. The chair of Scotland's Patients Association, Brian Lees, was taken to hospital as selfish. She added, if this is what they want to do with their lives, that's their choice. But other patients who are sick don't get to choose. Well, actually, a lot of these children don't get to choose either. If you're in utter misery, you've been told by, starting with Margaret Thatcher and others since then, there'll be generations growing up here who will never see work in their lifetime. Get used to it. That's what they're told on national television by the Prime Minister. What would you do at that age when you see no future whatsoever? Anyway, this is a planned ploy for taking them down, destructing them. By the way, it doesn't surprise me because H.G. Wells and others had the Scots and the Irish down for complete elimination of peoples who should not be allowed into the New World Order because they tend to rebel, judging from their history, just too often for the elite to be happy about. Anyway, it says they're taking up beds that are needed elsewhere. The vast majority of patients were rushed to Lothian's emergency departments, increasing strain on struggling facilities. Now, I remember back in the 80s, when coming back to Britain from other countries, and I couldn't believe the immigration that was just flooding in, especially from India. And along with that, I got to know lots of the tycoons that were coming in from India, who were buying whole streets of slums through Edinburgh, Glasgow, and different places. I knew them very well, actually. And they had every scam in the book going because they don't go by your laws or rules, like others too. There's others been in the country a lot longer who don't go by them either. But they were also importing drugs big time on shipping. And of course, Scotland, along Edinburgh and so on, you've got the docks, etc., and you've got lots of shipping coming in Grangemouth and all that, and drugs were coming in like crazy from the guys who are the masters of drugs from India, who are then residing in Scotland. So it's all planned long in advance. And the authorities obviously knew about it, but they weren't stopping it at all. Anyway, they go on about their Scottish approach over the last few years based on recovery and how it's basically not effective and so on. And it says that the vast majority of patients were rushed to Lothians, another hospital, increasing strain on struggling facilities. Now that's what happens. As I say, if I go into reservations in Canada here, you'll find the same thing. People who have lost their culture, they feel they have nothing left. They have seen no future. And you understand, your culture gives you your modus operandi and reason for being as well. And when that's gone, you self-destruct. Well understood in genocide. Well understood, for those who don't quite get it. And also, and by the way, it'll happen across the whole of Europe now too, with this new Soviet-type internationalist commission at the top that runs the new Soviet Union based in Brussels, the Parliament of the EU, as they denaturalize all the other countries too. And another one too is about sitting in a hospital cubicle, clutching his stomach. You'll see pictures. There's a guy who went in, he waited 6 hours, a young father actually, and it was a virus condition he had. He wasn't even checked for 6 hours, and he died right there before he did any treatment whatsoever. Could have been saved, but nope. That's the National Health Service for you too. We also know too, there's some countries that were in the Soviet Union. In fact, most of the countries that were under the Soviet bloc were plundered by the dominant minority who came in the revolutions from outside. And many of them were not from those countries at all, even the ones who ran the Soviet Union. Many of them came from Germany, and New York, actually, true. And they dominated the country right through the Soviet era, and their children took over as well. And a lot more still there. That's why Moscow is one of the richest countries in the world. Moscow itself, the richest city, as I say, in the world after New York City. But you find too, a lot of those ones who ran the Soviet Union liked the countryside, good countryside and nice houses, like they do everywhere else. And they used places like Slovenia for their beautiful, away from the work enterprises. But Slovenia gets a second agency debt downgrade, it says. So they're going to downgrade them, a country that's been abused for many years through the Soviet era. And it says, just weeks after Slovenia was downgraded by the rating agency Moody's, which means if it borrows, it's going to be a higher interest rate. it receives a new blow as Fitch voices concerns over a bailout. So they're almost at the bailout point now. And they have beautiful houses there that were built for the top commissars from the Soviet system. And they'll go for peanuts. This is the idea too, because there's big interest from other outside the countries involved, or coordinated interests. They like to flatten nations, and they go in and they buy up all the real estate. That's what's happening in Bulgaria, by the way. And the same guys who were members of the Soviet system call themselves other things now, like liberal Democrats, things like that. It's the same guys that ran the Soviet Union. That's how the world really is. It didn't fall, by the way. And all these guys had warnings it was coming and what was going to happen afterwards, and how they'd have to grab all the big oil fields, etc., and make the ultimate billionaires, which they have in Russia. Plenty of warning. Now, there's also a hullabaloo, I think, in the States about Supreme Court. It says, okays DNA swabs of people under arrest. Well, all they're doing is standardizing this across the world, because Britain's had it for years, so does Canada and many other countries. So join the club, folks. Everything is global. And that means even if you drop your arrest, doesn't matter, that's on there for life. You want a DNA database of everyone down the road. Another one too is 10 reasons why so many people are moving to Texas. Half of the 10 fastest growing cities in the US are Texas, according to new figures. So everywhere you look at it, there's a lot of people moving there. And 5 of the 10 fastest growing cities in the country between 2012 were in Texas, according to the new figures from the U.S. Census Bureau. New York is way out in front in terms of added population, but Houston is second with San Antonio, and Austin fourth and fifth. Now, in the big 90-page report put out by the top think tank for the military industrial boys, the Department of Defense in Britain and NATO, that I read in some of my archive section at cuttingthroughbarriers.com, 90 pages is worth reading. They said that eventually the US will be stripped down of its old cities, depopulated with moving folk out for work into third world countries. But also there'll be certain ones left that will expand. And they had Texas as a possible one that they would actually expand. So they're going along a plan where you understand it or not. Everything runs to plan. Folks, everything does.